So I'm going to talk a little about 160-meter receiving antennas. Might throw in a little bit about transmit antennas because sometimes they're good for receive. I got into this very early in my ham radio career back in 1965, just a few months after I upgraded to general. Lived in this house in Allentown, Pennsylvania on the east side. Had a wire up through the trees to another tree, simple L circuit coupler, and receiving antenna. What's that? Didn't hear of them in those days. My first contact was a W8CLH in Michigan. I had an SX110 and a Johnson Ranger. That's the way the station looked. I don't know who that guy on the left is. My first DX on 160 really wetted my whistle. You can actually work somebody outside of this country. VP9 EU, who was W3INH in the 1965 CQ Worldwide DX contest, CW. That was my first entry in that contest. I only worked a half a dozen guys that sent in a log. Didn't even know what that was all about yet. And 50 watts input. And I continued to dabble in 160, but I was chasing DX on the other bands and getting a little bit into contesting. Worked a few North American DX stations, but nothing outside of the continent until the mid-70s. I heard about a guy, W1 Bravo Bravo, W1BB, who was the king of 160 in those days, and he earned the first DXEC on 160. And he sent around a newsletter of DX information. Did it all on his own, just sent it to you, and had one of the things he sent out was this little graphic here of the inverted L antenna, which of course is very popular on 160 and a good transmit antenna. So in the late 70s, you know, college is history, all that stuff. Started my career in the newspaper business and ended up in Southern Connecticut. Bought a house in Shelton, Connecticut. It was a small lot, maybe a quarter of an acre. But it was a strategic purchase because even though the lot ended at about a third of the way past the house that's highlighted there on the left, the rest of the lot in the back, the next 200 feet, was owned by the houses down below, and they were down a 100-foot cliff. They didn't use their backyards, but I put them to use, starting with this beverage antenna. I discovered this antenna. I heard guys on the band talking about beverages, and I thought they were talking about their favorite brews. And one of the guys who was very active in those days was K1PBW in Western Massachusetts. He had a big station on his parents' farm. And he would sit there running Europeans. I couldn't hear a damn one of them. So sun would come up in Europe, and the guys would go up the band and rag you a bit on sideband. And I finally chimed in there and said, tell me about these antennas you're using. How are you hearing all these stations, or are you making them up? Well, he was running a beverage. Now, what is the beverage? The beverage is a long, low wire invented by a guy named Harold Beveridge, who worked for RCA back in the 1920s and did a lot of experiments up on Long Island. They used them for low frequency communications. They found they heard a lot better than the transmit antennas. So I built this one. Notice it has a bend in it. We'll talk about that a little later. It was only about 300 feet long. And later I added another one to the west. Now the first one, going back a slide, there was no feed line. The wire came right into the shack. And I had a rotary switch because there was no separate receive input on my rig. There was no, so I had a rotary switch to change from transmit to receive. And of course, everybody knows you can't use a beverage to transmit because it's too low to the ground. Well, one day I was talking to a VK6 and I turned it over to him and he came back, said, John, your signal went way down that time, but I copied you okay. Well, I looked up and I'd forgotten to flip the switch over. I had been transmitting on the beverage the whole time. So and on occasion they will work as a transmit antenna, but it's not recommended. So this was my second beverage, and that worked out well. Before we left Connecticut, I had one very memorable contact, the last one on this page, VS6DO in Hong Kong. I was, according to him, as the first W1 to VS6 contact. That was in January of 1981. Just before we moved to Bear, Delaware, now that's my wife up on the tower, Jeannie, AB1P. An acre and a third, a long, narrow lot. We put up a 100-foot Roan 25 with buried 200 radios under it. That was, of course, a good transmit antenna. The lot, however, was long east and west. So the best I could do toward Europe was about 185 feet. And it ran right next to that red dot, which is where the tower was. Now, it heard okay. I heard a lot of DX stations out of Europe on that antenna. But I discovered for too long that it interacted with the transmit tower. And in fact, that enhanced signals I was hearing on the beverage, because I could detune the tower just by chance. I had the right feed line lengths. When I flipped the antenna switch to another band, signals on the beverage went way down. I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. I'll keep it switched on the transmit antenna. Until a storm would come along, and suddenly I'm getting all kinds of precipitation static, and that coupling made the beverage worthless. If I detune the tower, by tuning it out of the circuit, I could then hear signals again on the beverage. They were lower in strength, but I could hear them. So it was my first lesson in the coupling between the transmit antenna and receive antennas. Okay, a few rules I learned about beverages back then and since. Keep the wire in a straight line. Don't no more than about a 10-degree variation from the desired heading. And if you look at that first picture, I'm sure I'm exceeding that, but you do what you have to do sometimes. A beverage in the correct direction is better than any beverage in another direction. That's why that 185-foot beverage was much better than the east beverage that was 300 feet and later 600 feet right along my property line and the neighbors. So you've got to have it in the right direction. Optimum lengths. We can all fit this one in, 900 to 1,000 feet. Keep the beverage 1 to 2 wavelengths. Again, that's 540 to over 1,000 feet from the transmit antenna to avoid interaction, avoid picking up noise. Keep the wire at a constant height above ground, anywhere from 3 feet high to 10, 15 feet high, but keep it even. And matching at the feed point is important. Okay, let's break some of those rules. A bent beverage will function. It's better than no beverage. That's why that one in my first house in Connecticut worked. And I've since then had numerous beverages that had to have bends in them. On the west side of or east side of my current property, there's what the surveyor called a meandering ditch of 18 courses. It's about 900 feet long. Well, I put a beverage up there 3 feet high, and it just follows that ditch. It zigs and zags, but the average over that whole thing is 162 degrees, and it works very well in that direction. If a tree limb or a tree falls on your beverage and stretches that wire down to the ground, it's still going to work pretty close to what you normally hear. I don't leave them that way too long when I see them, but it's better than not having that beverage working at all. Short beverages do work well. As I showed, I had a 185-footer. I've used them as short as 150 feet, sometimes even less. They have a higher takeoff angle and a broader beam width. So that's the trade-off with the shorter beverage. The longer the beverage, up to a point, you get a nice narrow beam width, so you're eliminating a lot of extraneous signals and noise off the back. Sometimes that shorter beverage will hear better than your longer ones, particularly in high sunspot times when there are more high angle signals at certain times of the evening. And you may find that having a short one in combination with a long one 10 or 20% of the time, the short one will be the better antenna. A short beverage, as I mentioned, near a transmit antenna may be enhanced by that placement, but it also may be hindered by it with noise pickup. There are ways to detune your transmit antenna in addition to the way I mentioned where it just happened to work out. You can put an LC circuit at the end of the feed line to detune the tower. You can put a relay out at the base of the tower to change the resonance. So you can work around that if necessary. Matching is important, but I have on numerous occasions blew the transformer, didn't have a spare, just hook the coax up to the wire. It'll work. It'll be the signal strengths will be down, but it'll still work as the beverage should. Some of my sketches from back in the 80s. The basic beverage. Notice at the feed point on the left here, there's a preamp. And that also helps with matching the wire to the coax. A simple wire and a resistor terminating at the far end, typically around 500 ohms. And the height, typically nice height is 10 feet, keeps it above deer level. People, most vehicles, that's a circuit of the preamp that we use there, was popular and passed around, used a couple of MPF 102s.
What are the two diodes on the left?
Okay, the two diodes are actually to help avoid overload from either your transmit signal or lightning. And sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't. So the conventional wisdom back in those days was you got to have a preamp at the feed point. Doesn't have enough signal level by itself. You know, it's already down low to the ground compared to other antennas. And it also helped to match the coax. And there were several types of preamps around. You could power it with a little 9-volt cell right at the preamp. You could run piggyback down the coax to control the powering voltage. But it would get zapped every now and then, and you'd be running out in the middle of the rain, in the middle of the contest to change those MPF 102s. That got old. In the end, we found the preamps weren't really necessary. Now, in Bear, Delaware, I had a rather abrupt awakening to this. I had stretched a half mile of feed line down to a vacant wooded area near our home, and had 3 beverages down there with a little homebrew relay box to select them, control voltage back down the feed line. And to power the preamp, I had an old battery, car battery. It put out all of 9 volts max. Well, one day, and it worked great, far better than that 185-foot beverage, because I now had a 600-foot beverage down in the woods and 2 others in other directions. One day it went dead. So I traipsed down there the next morning and find the battery's gone and some hunters had shot holes in my preamp box. So I said, okay, let's just try it without that. Put a matching transformer in there, didn't worry about the battery, repaired the relay box so I could still have my switching, and it worked just fine. Now, some of this may have been because there had been advances in the state of the art of the equipment we were using, that they had more gain inherently in them and built-in preamps. But nevertheless, from that point in the 1980s, I stopped using preamps at the beverage feed points. Now, sometimes you've got limited space and you want to have the same wire work in 2 directions. And there's a number of ways to do that. The way I did it in several locations was to use a little relay box like this sketch on the right, so that when you sent power, selected that feed line, and it would close, the voltage would close the relay, and the either preamp or just a transformer would be connected to the beverage, so you were feeding that end of the beverage. The other end had an identical box, but it had no voltage because it wasn't selected, so it was connected to the terminating resistor. And that was how I switched one wire back and forth with 2 feed lines from the shack to 2 directions. You can also run just with a matching transformer at each end. Just run 2 feed lines, no relays now. Run 2 feed lines back to the shack and select one or the other, and the unused feed line you would attach a 75 ohm resistor to. So that's how it is terminated. Now, just backing up, what is that termination resistor? That's what makes it unidirectional. A beverage is normally, without that, bidirectional, but still slightly better toward the open end than the fed end. You can also use a 2-wire beverage, either with something like 450 ohm line or homebrew 2 wires spaced 6 inches apart, and you put a reflection transformer at the opposite end, so you only feed it from one end, and that gives you the capability of switching it. You can also bring 2 feed lines, so you have both directions available in the shack simultaneously. This is great for multi-op stations. You can also use coax in the same way. The BevFlex 4 KB3Z has one of those, and with that system, you can put the feed point anywhere along the coax line. So those are some commercially available things, or you can homebrew them. Okay, so what do you need to build a beverage? You need wire. Doesn't matter, any kind of wire will do. A matching transformer, a terminating resistor. These are the cores. Feel free to take one if you can use it, that these coils are wound on. You need a couple of ground rods. Now, where I am, Chick.
Where you lay the cord, does it matter what mix that is?
This is a 73 mix. And this is a design, and I'll give you a little bit more about it in a coming slide, that WHJI, who's now down in Georgia, developed with some of his antenna designs, and it's the gold standard now for matching beverages. You can buy them commercially in a little box for $70, or you can buy the cores for 60 cents and wind them yourself and save some money. You need 2 ground rods, one at each end. I like to buy a 1/2-inch copper pipe because my ground's pretty soft and I can drive those in. If you're in rockier soil, you might want to buy a stiffer ground rod and just cut it in half. You don't need more than 5 feet in most cases. And of course, you need a coaxial feed line. If you're buying new, RG6 is very cost effective. You can get the flooded type for better protection, because sometimes it was funny when I lived in northern Delaware, I had critters chomping my RG6 all the time that I got rid of the hard line and switched all my feed lines to that. 60 miles to the south, in 22 years, I just had my first animal bite into a piece of RG6. So your mileage may vary. As to the wire, probably one of the most popular is number 12 THHN, like house wiring, singles, stranded house wire, insulated, just because it's commonly available. You can go down to Home Depot or Lowe's and buy it. Watch Craigslist, wherever. It's good for strength. It's got good, reasonable weight for its size, and it lasts a long time. I've tried some number 10. It's too heavy. You got to use more supports. It's so heavy. Number 14 works, but it's lighter, of course, and it tends to stretch a little more, and is a lot easier to break if tree limbs fall on it. Enameled or bare copper wire is fine, and you can run that over bare copper or wire over tree limbs. You don't have to have insulators on it. It works just fine. Galvanized steel wire or aluminum wire, fence wire, works okay, but galvanized will rust in a couple of years. Aluminum is pretty fragile, but for something temporary, they're okay. Military WD1A wire, which is 7 strands. I think 3 of them are steel and 4 copper, or vice versa. And it's like zip cord, two connectors. You just short them out at each end. And that's a nice feature, because if you think you have a problem, you can go out and just measure the closest end. And if you have that loop, the wire is still good. If it's open, then you have to go investigate and find out where it's broken. I like these plastic fence insulators. Some of these you can pass around. They're cheap at your local farm supply store. You can get them online. They screw in nicely to a tree, and they're open so that you can just drop the wire in rather than having to go through another type of insulator. Okay, this is an example of the transformer at the feed point, ferrite, and that's the number, also known as the BN202, 73 mix. For 75 ohm to 450 ohm, you use 2 turns to 5 turns. For 50 ohm, 2 turns to 6 turns. Number 26 solid insulator wire works okay at the tight fit when you're using six turns. I typically strip old Cat 5 cable or phone cable to get the wire I need, because I got plenty of that in the junk pile. But we can buy new. And there are other, you can use enameled wire, but that sometimes gets to be a problem wearing through. And some guys will put little Teflon tubes in there if they're going to use enameled wire to make these. That's another one of my transformers. I don't put them in little boxes. I certainly don't buy them in little boxes. I hang them out where I can see them. My daily routine, I walk the dog around the property, and I can see if they're a problem. For weatherizing, I want to keep these out of the weather, of course, because if the water gets on there and freezes, I have occasionally had them crack from the ice. So I'll take an old soda bottle and put a slit down the side and just pop it over the top of that whole assembly there, and that's my weatherization. And again, I can see through it. I can pull it off, check it out. Some guys who like to put them in boxes, they'll buy a box that has a clear cover. They're out there. They're more expensive. But, you know, I'm in the country. I don't have little kids wandering through, so I can get away with this. In a different situation, you might want more protection. You can mount this transformer down there, mount it here, or up there where the wire takes off. It doesn't affect the beverage either way. You got the same vertical drop no matter where you put it. So I like them right about eye level because they're easy to get to. I can stand there and make changes if I have to, or replace them. On the 450 ohm side, the antenna side, one wire goes to the antenna, the other to ground. Simple as that. The ground, just a wire going down, attaching to the ground rod. On the feed line side, the 2 wires just connect to the coax or hard line. If you want to ground the coax, go back about 15 or 20 feet and open up so you can get to the shield there and put another ground rod in. And if you have a real long run, and I have a lot of these that are 600, 700, 800 feet long, and they're made up of a multitude of sections of hard line scraps, I'll put a ground rod at each one of those junctions as another grounding point.
Why do you do that?
Because of the possible pickup on the feed line of stray signals from broadcast or unwanted noise, and that just helps keep that, isolate that.
What about radials at either the feed line or the connect point?
I'm sorry, say that again, Chick?
Radials?
Radials. Some guys have used radials at the end to improve especially if they have trouble getting a ground rod in. And I tried that at one location. Problem is, most of us are already limited in space, so you're shortening the beverage so you have room to get these radials in, and that's a trade-off maybe. But yeah, if you think you have a poor ground, that would certainly be an option. What? Well, you could try that. Yeah, there's some concern that putting them out sideways, you're picking up signals from other directions than you want. In all of my usage, I have not found radials necessary. I did experiment with them early on, and they just were never really necessary. Now, water table at my place much of the year, particularly in the DX season in the winter, it's ankle deep, so maybe my conductivity is better than somebody in the mountains might have. Okay, now here's the other end. It's one of the terminations. Simple post. That post can be metal, it can be wood, whatever you have. A lot of my stuff is hung up by trees because most of my property is wooded. The resistors on this, by the way, are non-inductive. That means either using one of the older carbon resistors, if you have some of those in your junk box, or the Ohmite OY type are a popular one to use. And just like at the feed end, that termination resistor can be down at the ground, can be up at the top, or it can be at eye level, anywhere in between, wherever you want to put it for convenience. One thing I like to do, usually at the termination end, is to put a pulley at the top. You can see one up there, just the tip of that post, and an insulator on the wire. And then there's a rope coming through the pulley, and there are a couple of concrete weights I made up down, sitting on the ground. So if a tree falls on that wire anywhere in its 500-foot length, it's simply going to pull those weights up. And there's enough slack in the ground wire going down to the ground rod so that it's not going to break the wire. So that even though it's on the ground somewhere, or close to being on the ground, it's still fully functioning. So it's just a nice little feature. I don't have that yet on all of them, but usually the next time one breaks because I didn't have that on, I go find a pulley and some rope and some weights and add it. So eventually I'll have it on all of them. It paid off. 1983, I got DXEC on top band. It was number 27. There wasn't all that much activity in those days. There were a lot of countries that weren't even allowed to get on 160 back in the 70s and 80s. ON4UN himself, who wrote a book about 160 meters, low band DXing, he didn't get on until I think it was the mid 80s from Belgium. Okay, 1991, we moved to a big old Victorian house north of Wilmington. Slightly larger lot, 1.9 acres. On a hill, though, it was 90 feet at the top, 30 feet at the bottom. It overlooked the Delaware River. Some of you may have driven by back then and seen the tower. We had 120 feet of Run 45 next to the house. And I roughly drew where the various beverages were. The one property line was 600 feet long, and I borrowed a little bit from the businesses down below to make an 800-foot beverage. Had relays at both ends so it could switch either direction. The thick red line was a 600-footer to Europe, and the other two in other directions, shorter wires. And even this was a much more urban area. You can see there's an apartment complex right next door. 1,300 feet away was on the other side of I-495 with 179 kV Delmarva Power high tension line, and the Amtrak line, which I could sit there and watch the arcing on the Amtrak trains going by. I could never correlate that to any interference. Surprisingly, all of my interference problems were from more localized sources. Power lines right in front of the house, whatever. So, and that's what the shack looked like at that place back in the 90s. And some of the okay, 1997, we moved to Kent County, where we're located now, the same house. 12 acres, midway between Felton and Frederica, mostly wooded, irregular lot, as you can see from the survey there. And I've always found surveys very useful, especially before the online maps became available, for plotting out where I was going to put my beverages, where I was going to put the transmit antennas. When I started out at this property, I said, okay, all the receive antennas are going to go up here. Transmit antennas are going to go down here. And that lasted a while till I just said, well, let's try this. And I found out they really could coexist with, beverages could coexist with the transmit towers. They might be noisier, but they were longer and in the right direction, so they worked. We moved in here December 19th, 1997. We had boxes floor to ceiling. We had downsized from 4,000 square feet to 1,700 square feet. And we hadn't exactly sorted things out yet. Christmas morning, I woke up early. You guys who are on Slack chat know I'm usually the first guy checking in. And I hadn't even unpacked the TS940 yet. I found the box. I didn't have an antenna. I found a piece of zip cord, 6 feet of wire, stripped the ends off one of them, plugged it in the SO239 in the back, and I started tuning around the band, 160. And I heard a JA. That's Japan. And I heard another one and another one. I heard a dozen of them on the first morning with 6 feet of wire. And I said, I think we chose wisely. I haven't run that test lately. I don't think it would be quite as good because I have, when we started, we had maybe a dozen houses within a half mile, and now there's 42 homes in a new development right next door. They're almost, well, they still have a few vacant lots, but they'll have 42. So this was the start. These were all single wire beverages in key directions. I was starting to get away from relays. I had gotten rid of all the preamps. Generally single wire, 10 feet high in one direction. And for the most part, kept away from my first 2 towers were where the number 1 and number 2 are. The number 1 was the driven element for the K3LR parasitic array with 100 feet of Roan 25 and 100 feet of Roan 45 for various Yagis, Tower 2. I had a preamp in the shack, but it wasn't always needed. In fact, and eventually I got rid of that altogether. And for feeding them, most of them were either 75 ohm or 50 ohm hardline, mostly for its durability. All of them just lay on the top of the ground. The exception is the last 60 or 80 feet right adjacent to the house where the yard is. They either got buried there or protected in some other fashion. And I gradually added a few more in other directions. That one I mentioned, zigzagging along the ditch on the east side, different directions. And I started experimenting with another concept that had been popularized, and that is the idea of phasing beverages. And that's what the 2 on a line to more or less to Europe on the left are there that are together, where you take, in this case, each one is 535 feet and they're staggered 132 feet. They're spaced 25 feet broadside. And they're fed with equal quarter wave lengths of coax and a delay line, quarter wave delay line, and this increases the front to back of the array, and very effective improvement in beverages. I also took the West beverage that was up on our top property line, northerly property line there, and through the courtesy of a neighbor, made it about 200 feet longer, and that helped in that direction. The phased beverages were nothing new. They were patented by Harold Peterson back in 1927. Again, an extension of beverages work for the long distance communications of the day back then. On 160, it began to be used by K1PBW, I mentioned earlier, WHAI, and our own WW2Y, who gave a nice talk on them at Dayton in the early 1990s, I think it was, and a few others in the 70s and 80s. So I had been thinking about these and finally had the space to start experimenting with them, and they really did make a difference. They can be stagger phased, they can be just parallel broadside, or they can be a combination of the 2 for the ultimate rejection down at the bottom. Okay, so I mentioned how we feed them. There are some alternative ways to feed them. WHAI used something called crossfire phasing, where they can be used on more than one band. I wasn't too concerned about that. Mine are uniquely designed for 160. They seem to work okay on higher bands too. I mean, I'll even use them in a storm when the rain static is killing the 20-meter Yagis. I'll switch to one of these beverages and they help. For broadside phase pairs, it's easy. You just have lines coming to a T, a little matching toroid there, and then the feed line to the shack. Now, what I did that, as far as I know, I'm probably the only guy out there doing this, and maybe the only one who's talked much about it at least. Rather than having fixed phasing on these stagger phased beverages, I bought a DX Engineering phasing unit, the NCC1. Their newer version is the NCC2. I have 3 of the NCC1s and 1 of the NCC2s. And these adjust the phase delay. Now the advantage is when you have a fixed phasing line, and if you model these things, you'll see that, well, okay, if I use a 90-degree line, it's going to put the null here, and a 105-degree delay phasing, it's going to be a little different. But with adjustable phasing, I can choose where the best rejection is. So if I've got a particular noise source or signal I'm trying to null out, I can do that with more flexibility than if I just had a single fixed phasing line. The way I do it is there's no delay at the antenna, simply two equal feed lines. And they don't even have to be equal because the phasing box is the full range of 0 to 360 degrees. So even if they're not equal, it's going to find the sweet spot for you. And you can make those adjustments right from the shack.
I think it's even better than that because it also allows you to select the optimal phase incoming, the incoming angle.
Yes, it's adjusting the whole envelope. Right. Yeah, and you can also instantly reverse the phase, and this is more useful. You'll come up to this soon with short vertical arrays, but it has an instant reversal on the phasing, so you can change that. And
It is, however, a lot more expensive than 50 or 60.
we'll talk about that too. Okay. The next thing I started playing with was short vertical arrays. These had been developed by WHJI, who back in the 70s, when I first got acquainted with Tom, he was in Ohio, loops in a line. Everybody was trying to come up with something then because we still had Loran, which was radio location on the 160 band, and it caused a lot of QRM that you couldn't hear a lot of the DX. You couldn't hear Japan from the East Coast. And he was trying to come up with a system that would null out some of that Loran so he could hear the JA stations, and he did. But he eventually threw away the loop arrays and started playing with verticals. And he came up with an element that's 22 feet tall with 4 sloping 22-foot wires coming down at an angle. And they work quite well. My first short vertical arrays used 2 of those. And I used the NCC1 again as a phasing box. And it was roughly equivalent in performance to a full-size beverage. But it was 2 verticals spaced 70 feet. That's a lot smaller footprint. That'll fit in most backyards. The other advantage with variable phasing, if you've got other things interacting that are affecting what that optimum angle should be, well, your variable phasing is going to compensate for that in some degree. Or if you have fixed phasing, you may just otherwise, hey, this thing isn't working, why? No preamps are needed with this vertical because they're actually resonant naturally at around the high end of 80 meters, and you use a small coil and resistor at the bottom for loading and matching. He developed an 8-circle array with these. An 8-circle array is basically a broadside end fire array of 4 verticals. We'll talk more about that in a layout so that you can switch them in 8 directions. The alternative to that is to use 36-foot elements with base loading. Now, Owen 4 UN came up with this, and he had a large field where he put his beverages out just in the winter because the farmer got to use that field in the summer. So for the summer, he put up a small 4-square array of 36-foot verticals and no top loading, just base loading. So I thought, well, the downside in my wooded property was those sloping wires. They were a constant nightmare having to bend the vertical. I'd use fishing line. Well, it would still break the fishing lines. I'd have to go out and retie it. And I finally said, let's try the 36-foot elements. And they work quite well. The alternative is to use shorter elements, what are called active arrays, because you have a preamp at the feed point. There we are, preamps again. I didn't like that the first time with beverages. And I've got some friends who are using, and they always seem to be complaining, oh, I had to send the preamp back to get it repaired. So I didn't want that. I decided to go with passive arrays without any preamps at the feed point. But a lot of guys are using the Accurate. I mean, High-Z is one system. They have various configurations. DX Engineering has several. The YCCC system, Dave's using a variation of that. So it's another choice. Both of those tend to use the fixed delay lines with the commercial systems. Those are three of the NCC1 boxes on my operating table. The first experiments with 2 elements were very favorable. I added 2 more to make it the broadside end fire array. And I could sit there and switch. I'd tune in a broadcast station to the northeast. It might be 10/9 and reverse the pattern the other direction, and they would just disappear. So it's got a very sweet, it is truly the optimum in my mind configuration with any vertical array. The only thing better is to have 2 of them in combination. K3LR does that on 80 meters with his transmit array. So the feed line from each element ran back to the NCC1 in the shack, and we had the 2 end fire patterns. And you also had an omni pattern, which was useful in to some degree.
This is like the W1 WCR stuff. Remember that?
I'm sorry?
This is like W1 WCR. Remember that book?
Yeah, that was one of the early books on beverages, and he did a lot of the stuff for reversible beverages, and yeah, I have a copy somewhere. It's been years since I looked at it. Okay, so this is what the broadside end fire array is. The 4 dots are the 4 verticals, northeast, southwest. The way I feed them, the spacing is roughly 307 feet broadside, and end fire about 70 feet on most of mine. The end fire can be a different length. There's not, you just get a different pattern. There's no absolute, if you do an 8 circle array, that end fire spacing is going to be around 140 feet. But I simply have 2 equal feed lines from the top 2 elements coming to a T in the middle, and then a feed line from there going to one of the inputs on the NCC1, on the phasing box. And the same thing on the other 2 elements. They're fed in phase, equal feed lines to a T, and equal feed line back to the shack. And so as I make the adjustments, I find the sweet spot. So you can switch it to null out a signal, and then you flip it to be the opposite phasing, and the signal comes way up. That's the peak. Easier to find the null generally than to try and peak the signal. Okay, I still didn't have enough room. I'm greedy when it comes to land. But we started with 12 acres, and just by chance, who lived behind us, he mentioned they were thinking of selling their property. He and his siblings had inherited it from when their father passed away. And I said, would you be interested in selling us just part of it? I didn't want another house. He had a house there on it. And he said, well, okay. So we started talking, and after a few weeks of discussions, a couple of lunches, we made a deal to buy that upper piece of property, of adding 5.5 acres. So now we had 17.5 acres. Most important, it gave us an area. You see that development there on the east side of my property. I now could put antennas, which would, when adjusted for peaking signals out of Europe, that development was off the back. So I got a great deal of isolation. I put up, so far I've got 2 arrays here. Now, I chose not to do an 8 circle array. I could have done that there. It would have meant pulling the whole thing closer to development. So it's a little more complex, more work, more elements, more feed line. But I have the red dots are roughly the European array and European and Southwest, and the blue dots are the JA Southeast array, depending on which way I switch it. How do these work compared to the beverages? Well, very good. Sometimes they're better, sometimes not. So it's just another tool. I typically I have a K3, and I typically listen to the beverages on the main receiver and to the verticals on the subreceiver. Sometimes in diversity, sometimes separate. And I can hear as the signals. So come up on one and then they'll come up on the other. Or sometimes they're about equal. So, and I had two other broadside end fire arrays on the original property, which used the top load elements, and they're still there, but they're no longer functioning. I keep stealing parts off them because they're not needed. I have plans already staked out to add two more sets, one north-south and one east-west. The elements on these are pretty simple. Number 12 insulated wire hung from trees. We have lots of trees. So they're not precise, as a fixed element might be, but they still, as ON4UN in his low band de-Xing book said about beverages originally, these things just want to play. So it doesn't have to be perfect. If you follow all the rules, you'll put all kinds of matching transformers and isolation and 0-degree hybrids and other things that he talks about in his book. Or you keep it simple. I like to keep it simple. On the JA array, the contest was coming up and I was running out of time, and I got these things up and I didn't have time to add all the matching. Just hook the coax up to them. One ground rod to the shield, coax to the center conductor. I go back and these things really play just like that. Now the signal levels were down because they weren't matched. That was about 2 years ago and I still haven't matched them. I'll get to it. The European ones, I did be more priority direction for contesting, of course. I did do the matching on there, so the gain is a little better on there. But I had also done without matching one of the original sets on the main original property, and they also worked quite well. Just plain and simple. So don't be afraid to try it from the basics and expand it as you go along. The systems that WHJI developed called for having radials underneath. So Tom's idea was either 2 radials 1/4 wave long, 4 radials 1/8 of a wave, 8 radials half of that size, etc. And W5ZN played around with 20 radials. And on one of my systems, I used that. On the 2 new sets, on this new piece of property, I did add radials on the 2 radials on 1/4 wave long on the European set. It didn't seem to make any difference. On the JA set, it's still just the ground rod. Now, the idea of the radials was basically to stabilize the system, which in my mind made sense if you were using fixed phasing. But with the variable phasing, if there are changes in ground conductivity over time, so what? You're going to change the dial to find the sweet spot. So likewise, the T connections, where the 2 coaxes come together between elements, we should match that, of course. I didn't have time for that. I just put the T connector in there. It works. Yes, I get a little more gain if I had that matched. So you can break a few rules and these things still just want to play. I've been thinking, and I haven't tried this yet, as Steve pointed out, these damn NCC1 and now the NCC2 box are pricey. They started out at $400 when the NCC2 is $800 or $900 now. And they seldom show up on the used market. For transmitter arrays, we use a little L circuit for phasing. A coil and a capacitor. That ought to work for this. So something to play with. It's on the list. Yeah, well, that may be part of the issue. Yeah, there's a lot of electronics inside the NCC boxes. There are other brands. The MFJ 1025 was actually also designed by WHJI much earlier. It does not have a full 360-degree range unless you modify it. There are a couple of other companies selling some of these boxes. I haven't played with any of those in recent times. So, okay, these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, or 4 of my almost soon to be 8 towers. Number 1 is the driven element. That's 100, now it's now 119 feet of Roan 25. That has wire T-shaped sloping T parasitic elements out 66 feet, and with relays to control them, so that at any one time 3 elements are working: reflector, driven element, director in one direction. And toward Europe, just up toward the corner of the photo, is another tower which acts as an extra director. So I have 4 elements toward Europe. The other 3 towers are not, other than they only serve as supports for some of the other wire elements. The red dots are the second transmit array. I was playing around with my plot plan again, the survey, a few years ago, about 10 years ago, and said, you know, the K3LR array is nice. It's about a little over 5 dB gain over a single element, but be really great if I could squeeze in a broadside end fire array. That's like 8.5 dB. So finally realized, hey, this will work. Now, the element down at the lower corner is only about 60 feet from the edge of the road right in front of our property, just off the photo here. The one at the top is actually part of the original array, and I've got a relay to switch it back and forth between the 2 arrays. So I can't use these arrays simultaneously. The other element is hung off one of the towers. It's actually hung off tower 2 and sloping over to a shorter tower that's off the photo. And the one at the bottom right, I had another tower out there, tower 6, I think it was, 64 feet originally, and I've since raised it up to 75. I was going to make an 80-meter array there, and when I started plotting this out, that got rededicated as one of the elements in the 160-meter array. So these elements, all 4 of that broadside end fire array, are T-shaped elements, similar to what we're used in the K3LR array, 73.5 foot vertical and 58 feet as a top hat. And at the moment, the 2 rearward elements toward the southwest are simply grounded through coils to parasitically act as reflectors. I have feed line out there, and they're going to be similar to the way the receiving arrays are set up with phasing, and so that I can reverse this array. There are also some other ways to phase it to get some other directions off of it. There aren't too many of these out there. K1ZM has one. WW2Y used one with inverted L's hung from trees in North Jersey way back in the 80s and 90s. And there's K9DX used a 9-circle array, which was a kind of a modified version of this, which had a center element. And N5IA, who's a silent key now, had one out in the southwest, an 8-circle array with full-size elements. So, but both of these have great directivity, as much as 25, 30 dB front to back. So they're great receiving antennas. There was a ZD9 coming up a few years back, and I was driving home from work. I had an hour-long commute. I'm thinking, damn, I've been meaning to put up that beverage towards ZD9. I hadn't gotten to it. I knew they were coming up, and then it suddenly hit me. Well, that's right off one direction from my K3LR array. So I got home, turned on the rig. I'm tuning in. There they are. Guys, I know where they are, but I can barely hear them. And then it reminded myself, try the transmit antenna. Suddenly they were 579, and I got them on the first call. So sometimes the transmit arrays do come in handy for receive. A lot of times they're too noisy just because they are verticals, but they are useful for receive. The footprint, by the way, on the red dots on the broadside end fire, 325 feet, which is 5/8 wave on 160. That's really the optimum. You get some little side lobes, but you get the maximum gain by that spacing, and about 148 feet end fire. I thought about going closer on the end fire as they did on the receive arrays, but the tuning gets a little trickier with the closer spacing, so I decided to keep it this way. Okay, I did promise some simple antennas for anybody who just wants to throw something together quick for the contest. This one's been around for probably as long as I've been in the hobby. That diagram's out of a 1970s QST article. It's a small receiving loop. It uses some coax, hardline, this particular one is 5 feet on the side. It can be a circle, it can be a square, it can be a diamond shape. The shields all tie together at the bottom, and you've got a variable capacitor in series with the center conductor. You break the shield for 1 inch at the top, and you simply adjust for maximum signal. Now, if you make it twice as big, 10 feet on a side, you get a whole lot more gain. And that's what I did. I've got one of these at 1,300 feet from my transmit arrays. The best characteristic of these, they're basically an omnidirectional antenna for skywave signals for DX, but for your local signals, there's a deep null, like 60 or 70 dB off the end of the loop. So I go out there, hook up a receiver, and rotate this thing till I hear that null. And now I can go back in the shack, and while I'm transmitting, I can tune up and down the band, hearing DX coming through on that little loop. So it's a handy antenna. Some guys will mount it on a rotor, so they could, if they've got a line noise coming up, they can rotate it to null out the line noise. While you can use the variable capacitor to tune it, once you find the sweet spot, you can replace that with fixed capacitors and then not have to worry about it going out of tune. Okay, some of you have heard of the Bog, Beveridge on the ground. Harold Beveridge, that was actually his first experiments. He threw some wire on the sand on Long Island and started playing around with it, later elevating it. So it's been in favor with those on small lots, similar to a Beveridge, but much lower gain. Preamp may help in this case, but not always needed. Ideal length seems to be about 200 feet, but this can vary depending on ground conductivity, which may vary during the year. But it's pretty portable. You can roll it out at night after your neighbors have locked the doors, roll it up in the morning. We were on vacation up in Maine a few years ago, and I had the IC706 along just to play around with. I brought enough wire to put up an inverted L. We were renting a cabin overlooking a lake. And along the way up, I'm checking my email, and suddenly I realized there's an FW0 that was going to show up. I needed that for a new one on 160. So I got to the cabin, put up the inverted L. It was only about 30-foot vertical, and I heard him the first day, but he didn't hear me. And I heard him the second day, and it was quiet. Well, as the week went on, it progressively got noisier. It was August after all, no surprise. And I was having trouble hearing him. So the nearest Radio Shack was 50 miles away. I wasn't going to make that trip. But we found a local home store, and they had some steel wire. So I got some of that, added some more radials, had enough wire to lay out a 200-foot Beveridge. Now, the IC706, there's no receive input. So what am I going to do? Well, they had a wall switch. I got the wall switch. I breadboarded by switching, cut open the coax so I could switch between the Bog and the inverted L, and I got them the next morning. So it worked. So if you have not enough room for anything else, try a Bog. My latest new one, A50 BOC, number 329 on 160. These things do work. I only heard him basically on one antenna. I was listening on a combination of the 950 with Beveridge and the short vertical array in tandem in diversity. But I did not hear them on any of the other. I even had a North Beveridge. They weren't as strong there as they were on this. And I wasn't sure what direction he was coming in, so I just transmitted Omni. That particular night, he didn't work anybody else in the Northeast. Maybe some Westerners later on. Some of the other results. JT1CO at the bottom, worked him in 2003. That was my last zone. Some resources, whji.com. Tom has got a wealth of information on his website. Get ON4UN's book. He's on his 5th edition. He is still alive, by the way. He may be working on his 6th edition. I don't know. You can get that from the ARRL. They sell it at HRO. My own website has a few things. Ask me questions. There's my email. Be glad to help. So. Thank you.
Questions out there? Anything online, Bob? John, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
We haven't tried 162.
CQ Worldwide 160 contest coming up. By the way, these are the resistors that are common, the ohmites. Want to see what they look like? Yes.
How busy are you playing with the antennas?
Very little. In fact, I have
So what you described here is.
I have 3 top 10 boxes on the wall, selecting 18 feed lines. Most, they're either single beverages or arrays, phased array beverages. I have a box that has subset, 3 switches for each of those boxes. And kind of the northeast bunch is here, the south bunch is here, and the west bunch is here. And below that, I switch one, I select those, I have one switch with 3 positions. Basically the European set, the south set, or the west set. So I select one in each of those, and then I have 3 directions in a hurry. Now I can go through all 18, but it takes multiple changes in 2 switches. So I'm not switching a lot. And what in the CQ 160 contest, I'm going to have my best European array on Europe whenever it's at any chance of working Europe, because that's where the best points are. I will have my vertical arrays on the other ear and listening in some other direction. So when the guys from the Caribbean call in or the guys from out west call in, I can hear them too. But if Europe gets really hot, forget that. All the ears are focused on Europe. And I will have, I have 3 or 4 beverages or sets of beverages toward Europe. I get a pileup of Europeans calling. I can switch through all 4 because they have different lengths, different angles. And I will separate the signals by listening on different antennas. Sometimes the short antenna will pick out the G3, the Russians coming in on the long wire. So that's how I do it. And when things slow down, that's when I turn on the second receiver, switch my right ear to that, and I'm scanning the band on that loop so that I can hear other things across the band, when I'm not getting enough responses on my own frequency.
John, I have a question from the web here. Mike K3RL asked how your receiving loop compares with a beverage.
It's not as good as a beverage. Well, it depends on what purpose. If you want a nice quiet antenna in all directions, that's the receiving loop. And for that, the purpose I'm using it so that I can hear while I'm transmitting, while I'm keyed down across the band within a few kilohertz of my transmit signal. It's excellent. But it's not going to hear the weaker signals farther out that the beverages in that direction will hear.
I have a question of my own. Have you ever heard of a log, a loop on the ground? Have you ever tried those?
A log loop, no.
It's like a beverage on the ground, but it's a loop on the ground.
Okay. Yeah, I've not tried that.
How about something like an EWE that, if you had really short lots, have you ever?
I actually had done some modeling and seen the U phenomena before Floyd wrote the article about it. And I just didn't recognize it. I'm not an engineer. I mean, he's an engineer. And he recognized it for what it was. It's no longer a beverage. It's 2 short verticals in phase. And I had seen that and actually probably had some what I called short beverages that were working the same way. But they tend to be lower gain than than a decent beverage would be.
So people,
I'm sorry?
Flags and pins.
Sure, if that's what you've got room for. If you can phase a couple of them, they can be really hot.
Question was about flags and pins.
But the advantages of them aren't as good as a decent sized beverage. But if you've got a small lot, they are certainly worth playing with.
Another question from the web. Mike asks, can you use an antenna analyzer to tune a beverage? Is that of any value?
You can, and I think the rule is, I seldom do it because I just cut and play with these things. And if you look in ON4UN's book, you're basically looking for a flat SWR over the whole range that you want to use it. And that's how you optimize the terminating resistor. And that basically the SWR should be flat over that
You're not
whole
changing
range.
the length to achieve that. You're just adjusting the
Just
terminating
adjusting the
resistance.
termination resistance. You can also adjust the termination resistance for best, put a receiver on it, adjust for best front to back on your band of most interest.
And the terminating resistor, this is what am I remember, is it's your ground resistivity is what determines your terminating resistance? Or am I misunderstanding?
The characteristic impedance of the antenna, which will vary with the height above ground. If you're going to have it lower to the ground, your resistor should be lower resistance.
Okay.
Something between 350 and 500 is typically correct.
Yeah.
Soil conductivity doesn't figure into this.
Yeah, I have not tried a beverage over salt marsh or salt water. I'm told that they don't work very well. Yes. And now I've got most of 40% of my property is League of Wetlands, but it's all fresh water. I mean, I slosh around there much of the year, but it's all fresh water, so it doesn't really, it helps.
On the other hand, if you have short verticals, it likes salt water.
Yes, indeed.
Very much.
Yep. Other questions?
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Great job.